One of the last volumes to be released for the BFI's A Ghost Story for Christmas DVDs was this one here. In the early 2000s the series was revived, and this particular volume encompasses the first two shorts of this new era of the show. A historian is waiting to be taken to the house of a certain Squire Richards with the task and job of cataloguing and evaluating a collection of archaeological antiques, with them starting to hear stories of hangings and seeing peculiar things in the wooded area nearby. But how does a pair of binoculars play into the proceedings? A View from a Hill was broadcasted on the 23rd of December 2005 and was adapted by Peter Harness in, I believe, what was his writing debut. This is quite an interesting little factoid of knowledge for me, as he would go on to write Doctor Who episodes in the 2010s to varying effects, such as Kill the Moon, which does something utterly ridiculous with the title location, and the pretty good Series 9 two-parter with the Zygons. Despite what background I have with the writer of the episode here isn't favourable through and through, this adaptation is another highlight from the overall series for me, and is another that I would rate a 10 out of 10 personally. A very creepy and unsettling play overall, and this and its sister episode on this disc are ones that I would not miss at all. On the 22nd of December 2006, the BBC screened the second part of this revival with an adaptation of number 13. As I have mentioned by now, currently, I have only read some of the original text stories of M.R. James, but by far my favourite of what I have read is this one. Anderson is a historical researcher and has travelled Denmark, staying in many different inns belonging to the country. During his expeditions he has noticed several objections to having a 13th room, one that is numerically labelled as such, in the inns that he has stayed in. For the one in the core story here, it is no exception. After some deliberation of which room to stay in for his work, room 12 is chosen, with number 14 being his neighbour. However, a mystery begins as to when he notices that objects move, his apartment getting smaller, and the window count in his room contracting at night. Could this have anything to do with a room 13? But surely there isn't one, right? Over the years there have been 4 dramatic television adaptations that I have made myself aware of in the due course of my own research. As I mentioned already, Mystery and Imagination adapted this story, but with it now having a slightly altered title of Room 13. With this and the second one that I am going to mention, I have not much information. This was one of 2 versions of the story produced for television in the 1960s, the first one coming 5 years earlier in 1961. This earliest one I also have little details, other than it was amongst the run of a series titled Great Ghost Tales shown in America, and that it was the last scheduled television series to be transmitted live over there. In 1980, an Italian television program started up called Il Fascino del Insolito, which roughly translates to The Charm of the Unusual. This, from what I can gather, was a 3-series anthology TV show that consisted mainly of adaptations of various short stories. In the first season, 2 M.R. James adaptations were present, being one of the Mezzotint and this main story here. I was able to find a black and white upload of this installment on YouTube, and in turn downloaded a copy for prosperity, because I feel that this is something that could easily fall into the crevices of obscurity, despite it having been up on YouTube for some time. I also ended up using the DVD booklet of the release shown earlier for some information, and even it doesn't mention this Italian production. After this, it would take some time for a follow-up film to occur for the series, with the previously discussed John Hurt adaptation not appearing until 2010. However, it wouldn't be the last time that this story was adapted this decade. In an extremely bizarre move, the BBC medical soap opera drama Doctors adapted the story for a Halloween episode in 2014. I have not watched this version myself, but from looking at a segment during this section's creation, it appears to have quite faithfully recreated the ghost, as in the original text it is described as having, quote, a face of crumpled linen. In the early 2010s, the BFI released their range of A Ghost Story for Christmas DVDs, as I have already detailed to a small extent. This was done as a part of a celebration of what would have been the centennial year of the birth of M.R. James, and they ended up releasing all of the currently made installments of this series up to that point, with the most recent being the 2010 version of Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad. If you were to go down the route I did, you would have the 5 individual volumes like so, which all ended up getting released in the first version of a complete box set of the show as well. The BFI, alongside these discs, ended up releasing this one titled Classic Ghost Stories, which is one of a few things here that I will detail later on. This ended up getting a standard volume release as shown, and also was included as a part of a second box set that collected all 6 of the discs shown here. More releases can subsequently be added to this collection in order to give a broader and more complete collection of various relevant screen adaptations and supplements. The aforementioned company put out a Blu-ray of Ken the Painter. Plus there was also other releases and bits and pieces, such as Network's release of Casting the Runes and Mystery and Imagination. There's also other relevant things that weren't able to be included in this documentary in dedicated sections as well, such as The Woman in Black from the 1980s, Dead of Night, The Stone Tape, Supernatural from the 1970s, and Crooked House. In 2022, this collection got further expanded with even more releases, like the first volume of A Ghost Story for Christmas on Blu-ray, and October's important DVD release simply titled Ghost Stories, cataloguing the films 12 through till 15 of the series. Mark Gatiss is a name known and mentioned in the Doctor Who fandom, having written several episodes of the revival, several original tie-in novels like Nightshade, as well as the incredible docudrama An Adventure in Space and Time for the show's 50th anniversary, along with some acting credits in the show itself. Thanks to him, this series has continued and seemingly has no signs of slowing down at the moment. This showrunner for this era of the show was brought up on the original films by Lawrence Gordon Clark, and prior to his first adaptation he created the TV series Crooked House, which was in part inspired by these just mentioned films. In 1932, the first medium retelling of a story by Montague happened, and as such the only one to have occurred during his lifetime, as he would pass away in 1936. I found the traces of this one during my research, and it states on Wikipedia that this was a reading of a school story during the interval of a concert on the 27th of October in 1932. Obviously this was just a reading of the story and not a full adaptation with a fully fledged cast like a radio drama. However, the first instance of this happened not too long after, in 1938, with a 40-minute audio broadcast titled Madame Will You Walk, which was based on Martin's Close by James. This was the first of many audio format interpretations and tellings of the author's stories. I am not very familiar with this spectrum in regards to these versions of the stories, but there have been examples of ones being adapted with this that either hadn't seen the light of day as television and film interpretations for a very long time, or simply haven't at all, one of which being Count Magnus, but this also comes with a bit of an asterisk and footnote, as I haven't mentioned unofficial productions, namely fan films. There's also a point of how this story was attempted to have been adapted back in the 1970s as a part of the original run. In 2014, Lawrence Gordon Clark released a book of his own ghost stories, and contained within this volume is a first draft script written by Basil Copper. Apparently it was rejected by the BBC in 1977, and neither them or ITV made it. Cost of location filming was reportedly the main reason for the rejection. In the mid-2010s, the only motion-heavy adaptation of this main subject tale, at least for a very long time, was created and released. This was uploaded by a YouTube channel by the name of Mansfield Dark Horror, and is a 12-minute version created utilizing narration, puppetry, and animation. With the same format of presentation of the tale, this channel has also released versions of The Story of a Disappearance and an Appearance and Mr. Humphrey's Inheritance. As well as these 3 M.R. James stories, the channel has also uploaded The Phantom Coach, originally by Amelia B. Edwards, and The Upper Berth, originally by F. Marion Crawford in the same style, along with an animation of The Room in the Tower by E.F. Benson, which is stylistically done so it visually looks like pencil shading drawings. Along with these animations, there have also been live-action fan films by other creators. There is a 19-minute version of Rats, a 13-minute version of Wailing Well, and an 11-minute version of Haunted Doll's House, all uploaded to the channel Stephen Gray Visual Effects and Motion Graphics. In the early 2010s, a documentary entitled M.R. James Ghostwriter was made and screened. Gatiss agreed to make this piece on the condition that he would be allowed to produce his own adaptation, and entry number 12, the Tractate Middoth, happened as such. These were broadcasted back-to-back Christmas Day 2013. This first film in the new era of A Ghost Story for Christmas starred now Doctor Who familiars Sacha Dhawan and Louise Jameson. Like with some of these stories, this wasn't the first time that the story hasn't been adapted in the past, with this being the third attempt to do so. This tale also has the unique distinction for being the very first screen adaptation of a story by Montague, broadcasted all the way back in 1951 underneath the title The Lost Will of Dr. Rant, as a part of an American TV and radio series Lights Out. Again, mystery and imagination comes into the fold here, as the second adaptation occurred within this show. Of these two, we are only lucky enough to have the 50s adaptation. Garrett, as played by Dhawan, is a student working at the library and is asked to find a particular book of ancient Jewish writings, being the titular Tractate Middoth. Upon looking for the book, they encounter a terrifying black cloaked figure that has a decaying-looking face covered in cobwebs. Proprietors of a boarding house offer Mr. Garrett accommodation after him needing to take time off from his fright. They in turn learn about a dead clergyman called Rant and a certain secret that the titular tractate holds. This installment to me was pretty disappointing. It overall is a very well made and put together adaptation of the story generally, but it lacked a distinctive and scary punch that many of the previous entrants to the series did. Dhawan's lead performance helped engross me and compel me further with the storyline, as they do a very good performance overall. I would also say that the Phantom of Dr. Rant is extremely well constructed and realised, as is the general production in terms of set design, shots and lighting. My main issue with this is to me that it feels more like a piece of drama than a scary story with a ghoul in my opinion. There are some very promising glimpses as to this being a great entrance in the overall series, and I can sit down and watch it. Just at the end of the day, what I have to say is that it's a good piece of television, just not a very good quote-unquote ghost story. It would then take some time for another instalment to appear on our screens. Mark tried during this gap to continue the series, presumably in its original annual form. However, he ran into issues as the 30-minute episode format of television was dead near enough from what they were told. Because of this, the longest gap between episodes during one of the runs happened, and it wouldn't be until 2018 that we would get a new one. Simon Callow stars as Aubrey Judd, a radio host that has been hosting a supernatural horror series since the late 1970s. The main narrative of what is currently the shortest entrance of the whole series, running at 28 minutes, is articulated around the recording of a new episode of this long-running series that is titled The Dead Room. Aubrey's behaviour starts to become erratic, and his production assistant Tara is starting to become concerned for him. Within a conversation between the two, details from the former's past are spilt, and a ghost from then is coming back to haunt our main character. This was an original script by Mark Gatiss, and of course ended up being the follow-up episode to the Tractate Middoth. And for me, this was a considerable step up from that episode. The way the overall film is structured and how it plays out is very well done in my opinion. Scenes of Judd recording the audio drama are great and have a real life to them because of how human they feel, with him fluffing his lines and even belching mid-recording. The actual things he is saying and reading that are being recorded for the radio play are very well written and creepy also. It was like a face, greasy and grey, a hideous and rotting carcass that slid towards him. Aubrey gets some excellent character work in this piece as well. The experience that they've had with ghost stories over the years is well shown, with him name-dropping The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood and The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral by M.R. James, whilst showing his love for these pieces. There's also an interesting moment with his colleague Tara, in which he is discussing ghosts and their stories, and ends up segueing into a Game of Thrones reference of all things, which I wasn't quite expecting. Overall, though not one of the best of the series, The Dead Room proved to be a unique and refreshing entry to the series for me, which had some very good and creepy moments. The dynamic of how the story is told and built is a great way of going about doing a part of the overall series, and it's nice to have, as I believe that the majority of M.R. James adaptations have actually occurred through the radio medium. With regards to the next part of A Ghost Story for Christmas, we thankfully didn't have to wait long, with a television version of Martin's Close being broadcasted on Christmas Eve of the following year. For Judge George Jeffreys, it seems like that this is going to be an ordinary procedural murder trial, with an accused John Martin being tried for the throat slitting of a certain Anne Clark. However, as attorney Dolbein begins to unravel the story of John and the killing, he reveals that eyewitness reports cited the victim as very much being alive after the date of the heinous event. My first exposure to watching A Ghost Story for Christmas on an original transmission was with a soon-to-be-discussed adaptation of the Mezzotint. Because of how I do things, I didn't see the second and third Gatiss-led episodes until the October 2022 DVD. I did have a gander and watched the Tractate Middoth on YouTube beforehand, however. As such, Martin's Close was ultimately the last episode of the whole series that I had needed to watch in order to have completed the series prior to the new 2022 instalment. So whenever I was going through the DVD in order for this documentary, these 4 films were almost all completely new to me, as I could barely remember anything from Dewan's episode. With prior knowledge that the finale of this disc was most likely great from memory, I ultimately got 2 episodes that I can describe as being quote-unquote nice entrance to the whole series. Ones that don't absolutely blow me away and aren't as good as the early era of the revival, aka pre-Gatiss, or the majority of the 70s run, but ones that I ultimately don't dislike. I'm uncertain if I rate The Dead Room an 8 out of 10, which part of me wants to, but I'd quite happily settle at a 7 out of 10 for Martin's Close. Ultimately, it is a well done, standard ghost story with some pretty creepy moments, such as the ghost of Anne Clark that ended up being the basis for the DVD cover. Like with all of the episodes from this newer era of the show, the characters and acting were good. It took me a bit to warm to the character of the judge, as played by Elliot Levy, but I did get used to this individual. Other acting highlights from this piece includes Wilf Scolding as John Martin and Peter Capaldi as Attorney Dolbein. Save for some criticism that I have about the structure of the piece in regards to how the narrative and scenes are knit together by narrated interludes that only seem to be there for a plot twist at the end, this is a pretty good entrance to the overall series. After what was a successful entry in 2019, the BBC commissioned Gatiss with the creation of a second original script for Christmas the following year. By February of 2020, Mark had completed a script for this with the title The Night Weddings. However, this story was shelved pretty quickly, as COVID-19 had started up and it was deemed to have been an unsuitable broadcast, given the, at the time, current status of the world, as it would have featured elderly people dying in hospital. In 2021, his fourth entrance of the series, the Mezzotint, was released, which ended up being a virus precaution safe replacement entry, as this one could have easily have been done with what had to be carried out with health and safety regulations at the time. The following year, the much sought after task of bringing Count Magnus to screen was finally accomplished on the 23rd of December 2022. And to quickly note here in the following, there will be some spoilers to Count Magnus. As I mentioned earlier, the former one is the first that I saw on broadcast, which is particularly significant for me as this show has likely taken over Doctor Who as of being my favourite TV show in the course of my outer exploration from that cultural phenomenon, although that could be an unfair comparative conclusion as one is so large. To me then, it is interesting to see actors from that sci-fi programme pop up in this one, like Sacha Dhawan and Louise Jameson in the Tractate Middoth, and Peter Capaldi with the previous film. The Mezzotint here does feature another Who-related actor, being Frances Barber, who played Madame Kovarian in Series 6, but the main reason for my rambling here is that if you're going into a ghost story for Christmas from the perspective of a Whovian, this may be one that you'll get quite a bit from. The plot is similar to that of the concept of the Weeping Angels, except instead of a statue that moves when you don't look at it, it's a painting that changes when you don't look at it. This was the 6th television version of the story from what I've been able to gather, and it very much follows my previous points about the Mark Gatiss adaptations and or episodes, but to a slightly stronger degree. For me, this is the best instalment from this particular era of the show. The elements of this being a ghost story are much sturdier and better than what was displayed previously. A comparison could be drawn between this one and the Tractate Middoth, in that a similar historical mystery is present and our main character needs to figure it out, but here the balance of that and the supernatural aspects of the proceedings is much better handled in my opinion. The acting as well is possibly the best from these recent four, with Rory Kinnear giving a great performance as the frightened museum curator Williams, who comes into possession of the titular Mezzotint. A great moment occurs between him and a character called Nisbet, as played by Nikesh Patel, where Williams's terror of noticing how the painting has changed from an ordinary manor house to now having a skeletal figure in front of the building is very well transcribed to the viewers. There is also a plot twist within that feels much more earned and purposeful than the one in Martin's Close. Simply put, this is the best of the Mark Gatiss adaptations, and is an improvement in the general area of his previous instalments. However, it is still not perfect, as the ending was overdone and it would have been better if it had stopped sooner. This isn't on the level of quality that the majority of the 1970s run and the early revival were, but it is a worthy entrance for the overall series. The recent Count Magnus film from 2022 follows the general ground rules, I guess you could say, in terms of how the Mezzotint was in regards to its quality and the whole paranormal aspects to its proceedings. As I hinted at not too long ago, I feel that Mark has very much honed and refined the foundational building blocks of his television tellings of the stories in the 2021 film, and with this one it further settles this point for me. Plus, also thinking about it, I would have said that Martin's Close displays some very good elements of the genre, but generally the showrunner's craft of it was perhaps shown better in these recent two. Like with the previous one, A Ghost Story for Christmas number 16 has some very solid elements of it being a story with a ghoul. With number 15, however, that was quite an in-your-face horror in terms of what was scary, despite no jump scares of any kind. And with this one, the frightening aspects are done in a much more subtle and measured fashion, whether it be noises and something being glimpsed in the background, to our main character noticing something odd about the casket of the titular Magnus. Another thing that I found to be rather neat with this piece is the narration. I didn't notice this whenever I first watched this back in December, but watching it again in early February, I picked up on the wonderful plot twist and detail at the end, being that it is the voice of the title character we are hearing throughout the runtime. This is nicely revealed over top of a modern day ending to the piece, which is a first for the series, I believe, and for me was a welcome addition. Whenever we do get to see the ghost a couple times in the episode, it is a really well handled piece of special effects work that has a nice Lovecraftian tinge to it, with the tentacles that we see emerging from the coffin. Mr. Wraxall, as played by Jason Watkins, is the humorous, often bumbling main character that is presented here. As I said, I've seen this twice and his main purpose to me wasn't that clear, and no, I have not read the original text version of the story. Apparently he's on a visit to Sweden for purposes of research in regards to a guidebook to Scandinavia that he is writing, and his curious nature leads to him finding out about Count Magnus and what is known as the Black Pilgrimage that the titular figure went on, with them having brought back someone or something according to the stories known and told. From the batch we currently have helmed by Gatiss, I would still personally say that the Mezzotint is my favourite, but CM is pretty close. My main issue with the former is generally a much larger one with the ending, but up until that point it was pretty solid. However, with this 2022 entry, there are some more on the nitpicky side issues that I have peppered throughout the runtime. As I said, the horror is quite subtly done, and there are two moments where it's wanted to be shown that the spirit is present or close by without actually visually showing them, which is a good idea on paper, but for both occasions a very cartoonish, stock-sounding evil laugh sound effect is used. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if I spent time researching and found it in an episode of Scooby-Doo. Another problem that I had was that after a very vivid description of the fate of a death, being he was once a beautiful man, but now his face was not there, because the flesh of it had been sucked away, off the bone. The entry feels the need to jump scare us and actually show what happened to this person, even though it had just been given to us in this very well written and creepy description that would have been better to have left stewing on the viewer's mind. Despite myself generally having a lot of positive things to say on this one, I feel that the 30-minute run length is too short for the story trying to be told, and the main character of Mr. Wraxall isn't my favourite from the whole series. I really do think that this would have been better as a 45-minute piece, and that in general is a negative I tend to have with the Mark Gatiss ones, in that they're too short and would be better as 40 to 45-minute episodes. As I mentioned earlier, a plot detail to me wasn't the clearest, but I could have missed something,
and I feel that with it being longer, the whole story could have been much more well refined. I don't think it's quite as good as the Mezzotint, but overall it has some of the strongest horror elements of this era of the series so far. I am interested in what Mark does next, but for me his run has served mostly as good companion pieces to the original series. Me hating his tenure won't be found at all, but I would still say that improvements can be made. With more freedom and longer durations, these new A Ghost Story for Christmas installments could be really good, and are on the brink of being so quite often. As mentioned, The Lost Will of Dr. Rant from 1951 was the first screen interpretation of an M.R. James story, but it wouldn't be long until more came along. In 1954, the BBC produced two adaptations that are now thought lost. The first adaptation of the Mezzotint, and currently the only TV and or film version of Canon Alberic's scrapbook, were these particular two. The most promising piece of information in regards to details on these two that I can find was that they were narrative versions with some visual effects performed by one actor each. I'm also going to assume that they were broadcasted back to back, as I have only found one transmission date for both. The second version of this story of a haunted painting comes by way of an uncredited adaptation in 1969. As a pilot for what would be his Night Gallery series, Rod Serling created a made-for-television film that was an anthological supernatural horror movie, ultimately split into three segments, the first of which appears to have been based on the Mezzotint, with several plot elements being echoed within. Entitled The Graveyard, this showcases a selfish man that murders his uncle to inherit his estate. The dead uncle's butler acts revenge by staging a series of slightly altered paintings that appear to show the murder victim rising from his grave and moving closer and closer to the killer, Jeremy. After the death of the criminal, the servant pays his respects to another painting at the end of the entry, only to see the exact same thing occurring, but with the now thought dead Jeremy emerging from the grave. The 1980s was quite the decade for adaptations of James stories, with the Mezzotint appearing 3 times in adapted form. The first of these that I will mention here was the previously mentioned Italian show Il Fascino del Insolito, which cropped up with my segment on number 13. The second appeared in a 1980 children's series titled Spine Chillers, alongside versions of A School Story and The Diary of Mr. Pointer in the same show. These 3 were collected with another 5 into the disc release Classic Ghost Stories by M.R. James, put out by the BFI. The latter handful were adaptations of The Mezzotint, The Ash Tree, Wailing Well, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You My Lad, and The Rose Garden.